The following content explores the movement of paper as triggered by external pressures. A film by Dhiya Apsari. Paper as a singular material has a soft and flat surface. Paper can be a vessel to hold information, being a surface of artwork, a vessel to hold other materials, and many other uses. I'm exploring this material with alchemy in mind, as Pacini, Ketchabau, Kind, and Kocher said in their book of encounters with materials in early childhood education. They suggested to struggle with materials and to learn from them. Find out what happens to them, to see what they feel and what they look like. I use this as a guide when exploring through a series of gestures and movements to reach my goal. I started by noticing the papers around me, how intertwined our life with it. The first thing I noticed was the parchment paper and their absorbent quality. As a vessel of food, they could contain materials, however, liquids protrude through. I noticed the changes in its transparency, losing its integrity, making it easier to break. I found the same experience when introducing water to paper. It has the integrity to hold droplets of water, even puddles of water. The paper maintained its movement when water dripped. When waited patiently, the puddle of water gets absorbed gradually until it affected the integrity of the paper. I saw the gradual movements of the particles in the paper getting more and more translucent, suggesting their declining integrity. Not long awaited, the parchment paper gently rips apart. I explored with using regular paper, and I found the difference in the fastness of the water absorbed. I could see the little droplets of water disperse on the paper immediately. Exercising the Hundreds of Languages by Loris Malaguzzi, I felt the need to wonder as I continued to crumple the paper. I wondered what will change in its properties. I was surprised by the change in texture. What once has a soft and flat surface suddenly become this coarse spherical object after being gone through simple active movement. I tried to flatten it back to become what it once was. However, I continued to be surprised as the paper had creases that was rather deep because of the trauma it had endured. I experimented with newspaper this time around. I observed its movement. The stacked paper resulted in the sturdiness of the object. As time went on, I trusted my instinct to rip the paper. Firstly, I was so scared to litter my surrounding that I resisted to do it in the first place. I was reminded by Pacini, Ketchabau, Kind, and Kocher to not resist the thought of imperfection. Each ripping movement created a much smaller paper with a mind of its own, making it harder to maintain. I would find them spread on the sides of the room, having the ability to consume more space than it once was. At this moment, I saw how paper lives and moves in the world. Their presence, which ebbs and flows, allowing them to fly from one space to another. More paper was shredded, each one falling gracefully on top of one another, forming a rather tall pile. I stopped to think that each paper fell in rhythmic motion. An intrusive thought came into mind to throw the papers up in the air to see if the rhythm remains. Taking a leap to observe different angles of the paper's motions and an attempt to explore the rhythms of the paper to convey my expressivity. With movement in mind, I kept things in motion. I found myself squeezing these paper strips, stomping and jumping on it, and brushing my hands on the pile. I saw how these movements interact with each strip, how some stayed in the group and some were caught by the movement of the force. Pacini, Ketchabau, Kind, and Kocher mentioned this quote that inspired me to do this next exploration. Materials are always and already on their ways to becoming something else. My mind was racing, finding ways in how I could extend the exploration with these paper strips. Perhaps it came from our human instinct to fix what's broken. I thought of assembling these strips together again. These back and forth thoughts I had becoming a rhythmic movement of exploration. It created a constant flow of doing and undoing. I felt connection with this exploration with paper. The learning, knowing, and understanding had been a pleasure to go through. I felt the pleasure of understanding, one of Malaguzzi's reflection of the Hundred of Languages. It says to build a constructive feeling, to further connect the pleasure of learning, overcoming difficulty, and transform it into joy. I understood the movement of the paper enough to further extend the exploration by assembling the strip together. The lack of material I have at home didn't stop me. I made a concoction of flour and water to connect the papers together. I set aside the pressure of making something and let the pleasure of understanding take the lead. I separated my thought and effort and focused on the ride of joy. I focused on every drop of the glue concoction and the movement it made, how it dispersed into the paper strips, building a connection with one another as I was building a connection with this art. As I was paying my attention to each drop, I moved them along, spreading them to consume more space. Every drop described my expressivity. Every drop ended these papers' singularity. Thus conclude my exploration. I'm proud of myself by thinking of the hundreds of languages and movements in mind, constantly surprised of the little move paper does, ones I usually overlooked.